At the height of the Greek economic crisis, protesters scaled the Acropolis to hang a banner. The banner read, "People of Europe, rise up." This symbolic act highlighted how architecture collides with events. We often think of architecture as a static object, but it can be thought of as fluid and responsive. Architecture is social forces taking form. This is true on the scale of the building, and this is true on the scale of the city. Iconic buildings like the Acropolis tell us a story about where a city is at a moment in time. So, what story is this building telling us, and what story is it telling us about Athens? Presently, Athens is all about the protest. Last year, there were over 1,000 protests in the city. There were marches and demonstrations, strikes and occupations, rogue broadcasting, and rogue bombing. In other words, I offer you all a welcome to Athens, where there is no time like the present crisis. Protest is important because it is a symbol of how we define democracy. It is the space of democratic legitimacy. I've been looking at how protest instigates space and inscribes events on buildings, and how this helps us understand the larger issues of the world, how the present political crisis in Greece can be examined from the discipline of architecture. To do this, I've been mapping the city of Athens relating to protest, how it moves and interacts, assembles and contracts, negotiates and permeates. What the research has found is twofold. First, protest has taken on its traditional form of the public square, a vast concrete plaza located adjacent to Parliament. But secondly, and more interestingly, protest has taken on a site of exchange between people and buildings during smaller scale semi-permanent interventions, where it gains a formal capacity to transform symbolic buildings through events. However, these new forms of protest have found a new building type to situate themselves on: shopping malls. Before the economic crisis, there were 3 shopping malls in Athens. Now, there are 6. The shopping mall can be viewed as the public square commodified in the Eurozone. This enables me to position Athens as between 2 different spaces of protest: traditional protest in public squares as symbols of democracy, and new spaces of protest on shopping malls as symbols of market democracy. What I have learned is that architecture is not static. It is not a fixed stage for events. It is fluid, it is responsive. Architecture is social forces taking form.
Thank you very much. And a question from the judges for our last contributor.
So as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the protests we've recently seen here in Adelaide. Might seem like it's a bit far afield, but I was just curious if you had any thoughts about where on that spectrum that you drew sort of our typical protests are in Australia, particularly, say, the iconic protest on Parliament House steps or something like this.
Well, the protests in Adelaide have been great because I'm doing a lot of practice for when I go to Athens later in the year. But essentially what the thesis boils down to is architects are very good for designing space for intended use, and there's design spaces of protest like Parliament houses. But what I'm specifically looking at is what happens to buildings when they are misused by protest. So whether or not that leads to a change in design, or whether or not we just have to accept the consequences, is a different matter. Thank you.